Are you feeling anxious and depressed at the same time? And is this scaring you or making you feel doomed? Because now instead of one mental health problem, you think you have two? This is actually a pretty common experience for people who deal with anxiety. People who are anxious for a long period of time, chronically, often begin to experience lower moods, hopelessness, and depression. But that doesn't mean that there are two different problems that are happening at the same time. And it doesn't mean you're chemically, biologically, or psychologically doomed. If you give me about 7 minutes today, I want to try to explain to you why anxiety and depression tend to work together, but in a functional sequence, and what you can do about that to try to solve the one problem that's actually keeping you stuck. Let's look at a metaphor. We'll call it the radius of life. How big is your life? In anxiety disorders or chronic states of anxiety, we see huge amounts of avoidance, restriction, ritualization, escape and safety behaviors, and conditions being set on life that are all designed to prevent the trigger. And as we add restrictions, the radius of life begins to get smaller and smaller and smaller over time. And when that happens, we lose touch with the very activities that we know support human well-being. We don't socialize. We do not interact. We lose touch with our hobbies and interests. We become so consumed with monitoring how we feel and trying to control it that that's all we care about. We stop working. We stop learning. We stop doing. In short, we just stop doing enough to support a stable mood. And what's worse, your body is on constant code red alert all the time, looking for the next sign of danger or threat or discomfort. We can easily wind up in a state of social, emotional, mental, psychological, and even physiological resource depletion. And when we get resource depletion, combined with a shrinking radius of life isn't much fun or very satisfying anymore, we start to get low mood. And when we are trying to stop that from happening and it happens anyway, we can start to feel hopeless, and hopeless is directly on the path to depression. Let's think about this metacognitively. We can use concepts from metacognition theory and metacognitive therapy to build a bridge between anxiety and depression. In metacognition, especially in the case of anxiety and anxiety disorders, we start to care a lot about things like worry and rumination. For an anxious person who is constantly trying to not be anxious, they will spend a huge amount of time and focus all of their attention on watching what their bodies are doing, what thoughts their minds are making, what emotions they're having, and just generally monitoring their internal experiences. Then they try really hard to control those internal experiences. But try as they might, they are unable to do that with any sort of consistency or reliability. And when you are constantly on guard for something that you are trying to monitor and prevent, but can't, you wind up in a state of worry and rumination. And when you are trying to fix or control your anxiety and you cannot, that worry and rumination gets really negative. You start to experience a sequence of repetitive negative thoughts. Okay, that's really important. Why? Because in the therapy world, one of the primary theories of depression that we rely on tells us that depression is likely driven by repetitive negative thoughts, repetitive negative thinking. So if you are chronically anxious and you wind up in a thinking loop all the time because you are trying to understand, control, monitor, and figure out your anxiety, but can't, and keep trying again and again and again, you clearly have a sequence of repetitive negative thoughts. I'm never going to get this. I'm never going to figure it out. What is wrong with me? What is the point? This is never going to work. That is a resource depleted state of hopelessness, and that is a perfect recipe for depression. So here we have our functional sequence, our bridge from chronic anxiety to a depressed state. Okay, so what do we do about that? Well, it's a really good question. Remember, at the beginning of the video, I asserted that you probably don't have two problems to solve. You probably only have one. Now, if we can follow that functional sequence, that bridge from chronic, uncontrollable anxiety through a shrinking radius of life, resource depletion, and a sense of hopelessness driven by repetitive negative thinking, we can call the depression situational. And spoiler alert, the situation is the anxiety. So for people like me who specialize in treating anxiety and anxiety disorders, when we see this combination, which is actually quite often, we tend to focus the therapy efforts at the anxiety. We don't necessarily treat the depression directly unless we have to. A lot of times we can work on the anxiety. So how does that work? Well, if we can use the most clinically validated, empirically validated, proven techniques and modalities to treat anxiety and anxiety disorders, things that are not control based, but acceptance and mindful non resistance based, that also include, sorry to say it, but an exposure component, we get good results. What does good results mean? People learn that they do not have to monitor themselves so often. They do not have to fear their own bodies and minds and thoughts and emotions. They start to have the radius of life expand again because they lose all those restrictions. They are not constantly monitoring and checking, so the resource depletion begins to fade. And they have no reason to loop and ruminate. They may be worried about continuing to improve, but they're actually improving. So the repetitive negative thinking starts to lift. And therefore, so does the sense of hopelessness. When treatment is working, people don't have to see themselves as hopeless anymore because they are learning that they are capable of handling those states that they previously thought were no go. So when we focus on the anxiety and we take away the conditions that led to that situationally developed depression, as it turns out, the depressive mood tends to resolve itself. Now, is this universal, absolute step-by-step instruction for every single anxious person that is experiencing depression? Of course not. I am describing a common but pretty specific situation, and I'm doing it from the 30,000-foot view. I'm here to give you general principles because while I am a therapist, I am not your therapist. So if you fit this description and you say, hey, this is me, I kind of want to look at this, you'd have to really look at the best way to apply these principles in your unique circumstance. Unfortunately, I cannot tell you that, and I cannot give everybody universal advice and steps to follow that would apply in every case. That just doesn't work that way. So my goal here was to help anybody who is suffering from chronic or disordered anxiety, who has found that morph into a sense of hopelessness and what looks and feels and therefore is depression. Well, there's hope. You are not doomed. You do not have problems chemically stacked on top of each other from which there is no return. Things are not getting worse for you. And while you may feel worse and feel more hopeless, there is in fact a way that we can address that. And that's what I'm hoping that you can sort of grab onto, get a little hope, not see yourself as eternally broken, and know that there is a path that you can follow, and you may need some help to follow it that can help you get out of this mess. Now, how do I know that? Well, we see it across a lot of research. We see it in the clinics. I see it in my own practice, and I live the experience. But my lived experience is the very least of my qualifications. I can just tell you that I do know what it feels like to be both anxious and depressed, and to be depressed because I'm anxious. And I know what it feels like when that starts to lift. It's really great, and I would love that for you. Hopefully, you have found some use in this video and you found it helpful or applicable in your situation. If you've hung in there all the way to the end of the video, I appreciate that. If you liked it, I would consider maybe hitting the like button or maybe subscribe to the YouTube channel because that tells YouTube that you dig what I do and then they don't bury me like they usually do. Thanks for hanging in there today. I hope you could take something out of this. I will be back in next week. I guess that would be because I'm recording in January of 2025 in this video. I'll be back next week with an episode of the Anxious Truth podcast. Don't know what I'm going to talk about, but I will be here. Thanks for hanging in there. I appreciate it. I'll see you in the next video.